I need to try to keep track. Am I unmuted now? Yes. Can everybody hear out in on the internet? Yes. Okay, let's get started. Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Will Hedberg. I am an associate professor of Japanese here in Silk and the associate director for the Asian Center. I just want to welcome all of you to the first installment of our ongoing lecture series, now in its second year. Global Asian, a Multipolar World, series that invites prominent scholars from an array of disciplines in the humanities, arts, social sciences, even the hard sciences, to speak about interregional connections across Asia, flows of text, flows of people, goods, ideas, languages, etc. We are delighted and honored as our inaugural speaker to welcome Professor Miriam Kingsberg Kadia, who is Professor of Modern Japanese History at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Professor Kadia has many interests and fields of expertise, including the history of narcotics in East Asia, the development of the human and social sciences, both in Japan and globally, and most recently, the history of time and time use. In addition to publishing in an array of highly prestigious journals, including the Journal of Asian Studies, Monumenta Niponica, the Journal of Japanese Studies, and Modern Asian Studies, Professor Kadia is the author of 2 monographs, both of which I heartily recommend if you haven't read already. Her first book, Moral Nation, Modern Japan and Narcotics in Global History, was published in 2014 by the University of California, won the Eugene V. Caden Book Award. And her second book from 2019, I think will be part of the inspiration for today's talk, is Into the Field, Human Scientists of Transworld Japan, that looks at the development of the human sciences in Japan from the 1930s to the post-war era. It'd be quicker to list the fellowships that she has not held, but I'll find a few highlights. She's been a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study, the ACLS, the Harvard University Academy for International Area Studies. So again, we're just very, very delighted to welcome Professor Kadia. Please help me in here. Thank you.
I did ask Will to keep that short. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's really I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to speak about this material. My book came out in 2019, as Will said, but this is my first opportunity to talk about it with a live audience in person since then. So this is a real honor for me. And I'm especially grateful to Dr. Hedberg for not just organizing this talk, but so many years of friendship and inspiration. So today I'm going to talk about the term Nikkei, which denotes the ethnic category of Japanese immigrants and their descendants in the Americas. And the word Nikkei is today ubiquitous in both the public forum and scholarship, but researchers have surprisingly not yet traced its genealogy. So where did the term come from and why has it become so universal as a referent? These are the questions that animate my talk today. I would like to say this is a fascinating story, one that I stumbled upon in the course of researching my book Into the Field. The book traces Japan's scholarly engagement with diversity from the 1930s through the 1960s. So what historians have now called the trans-war period, across these political contexts of imperialism, war, occupation, and independence. So as I'll show, the term Nikkei emerged out of a collaboration between, on the one hand, Japanese immigrants and their descendants in Brazil, who I'll return to in a minute, and on the other hand, human scientists. So the term human sciences is pretty out of fashion now, but was quite common in the trans-war period. And at that time, human sciences encompassed all fields of inquiry that critically engaged with human diversity or difference. Put in old-fashioned way, human scientists were scholars of self and other. So they use great constructs such as race and culture to categorize individuals into populations, relate populations to each other and to the geopolitical map, and to project their futures within a changing world. I'm thinking maybe I should maximize this window actually. Is that more helpful? Most of the slides won't have this much text. That didn't change anything.
You go to presentation mode.
Under the caption, if you pull it down a little bit.
I'm a little lost, I think. Maybe I'll just do a new share.
Under slideshow, you click on slideshow up in the banner.
Oh, here it is. Okay. Sorry about that.
And play from current slide.
There it is. Right? No, didn't change. It changed on my screen. I'll try the new share again, see if that works.
Oh, you need help? No. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I want to make this like a better viewing experience.
The power.
I should have done this before. We're just one side for that.
I'm not sure though that they can see.
Yeah, so I need to the Zoom screen.
I need somebody else's.
I don't think it's that big a deal. I'll just soldier on maybe. Oh,
yeah, but then the people online won't be able to see.
I don't actually think there's anyone online.
Okay. And so now if you click here.
Here?
No, on
this one?
Yeah. Perfect. Now they should be able to see the full. Okay.
Thank you so much. My Zoom skills need some work. Anyway, we were talking about the human sciences. So basically, the human sciences used concepts such as race and culture to categorize individuals into populations, relate populations to each other and to the geopolitical map, and to project their futures within a changing world. So more than ivory tower academics, mid-century human scientists functioned as public intellectuals, and their production of knowledge validated their authority. In and beyond Japan, the trans-war period witnessed the apogee of their influence over popular and scholarly conceptions of nationhood and national identity. So as I've put here, the disciplines of the human scientists included, but were not limited to humanities and social sciences like archaeology, physical anthropology, cultural anthropology, ethnology, minzokugaku, or native ethnology or folklore, minzokugaku, history, art history, geography, linguistics, religious studies, political science, sociology, and other fields. So what cohered these disciplines as a group was their common methodology of scientific fieldwork. And so scientific fieldwork at this moment was defined by systematic, theoretically informed, holistic data collection, long-term immersion in local life, they called it native life, minimal contact with metropolitan society, and communication with informants in their own language. And so given the significance of fieldwork in anchoring the human sciences, my book focuses on the career of Japan's foremost mid-20th century fieldworker, Izumi Seiichi, who you see here later in life. Izumi was not simply representative of his generation of human scientists, but I would argue its linchpin. He was extraordinary in his thirst for adventure and his ability to connect with different individuals and audiences. In addition to his native tongue, Japanese, he mastered functional Chinese, English, Korean, Portuguese, and Spanish, as well as a smattering of other languages. And his output ran the gamut of trans-war media, academic articles, monographs, autobiographical works, newspaper pieces, writings for children, travel guides, film and television documentaries, and radio broadcasts. He maintained friends and colleagues in upwards of a dozen countries. Izumi chose field sites, research topics, and audiences that not only reflected, but also advanced his nation's understanding of an engagement with the wider world. So at this time, Japan was well integrated into the Euro-American scholarly community, contributing to international academic journals and conferences, sending visitors to foreign universities, and hosting scholars from other nations. The outbreak of sustained war in the 1930s introduced new political, ideological, and even physical boundaries among people, impeding the participation of Japanese human scientists in the transnational academic network. So rather than continuing to cultivate ties with the great powers, Japan came to focus on the development of intellectual connections within its burgeoning empire. And human scientists took on a new role in providing ideological legitimacy and practical information on behalf of imperial rule. And so the next slide is just to warn you, a little disturbing. With funding from the government and military, they furnished quote unquote evidence of the physiological, cerebral, and moral superiority of the Japanese people and their consequent right and even obligation to impose their sovereignty over the allegedly inferior but confraternal peoples of Asia and Oceania. Field workers also undertook research to facilitate the exploitation of human and natural resources, the pacification and administration of conquered territories, the assimilation of populations within the Japanese Empire. So here's a map of Izumi's field sites. In the pre-war period, they included Jeju-do, which is this, can you see this island here off the coast of South Korea, which he represented as a cultural stepstone between colonial Korea and Japan. Inner Mongolia, Mokyo, where he sought anthropological justifications for Japanese domination. And finally, New Guinea, which is zoomed in here, where he gained the trust of indigenous communities and then shared the rotation of their food stockpiles with the Imperial Navy. The Navy in turn acted on this information to facilitate the conscription of forced labor. And when the indigenous population resisted, ultimately it resulted in a massacre of over 2,000 in 1944. So the defeat of Japan was a seismic shock to the system of imperial knowledge production. Between 1945 and 1952, Japan was occupied by the US under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. The occupation was not only a military, but also an ideological event that sought to reshape Japan according to the professed values of the US: democracy, capitalism, and peace. So I want to stress that these ideals functioned less as political and socioeconomic realities than as the moral core of American identity. They were both an antithesis to the fascism, statism, and warmongering of the Axis enemy of World War II, and also to the socialism, communism, and totalitarianism attributed to the Soviet Union, the emergent antagonist of the Cold War. At its most basic, democracy encompassed just representative government freely chosen by informed and empowered citizens. Capitalism was thought of as a free market economy with few state-imposed barriers to participation or profit. And peace meant secure borders, domestic stability, and armed forces capable of defending the nation's interests abroad. So during the occupation, the US sought to align Japan as an ideological ally amid the nascent Cold War. And under these circumstances, Japanese human scientists, who were among the most educated, articulate, and influential members of society, had an important role to play both in spreading and finding evidence of these new values. Through research that represented Japan as democratic, capitalist, and peaceful, they hoped to overcome its reputation as a militarist, imperialist, and fascist power. It should be noted that I think self-interest was also at play here. Many Japanese human scientists were also very keen to rebuild their own careers at a moment when academic jobs were scarce, and they needed to erase the taint of their prior association with knowledge production in the service of the wartime state and empire. So it was under these circumstances that Izumi became the first Japan-based Japanese scholar to conduct post-war fieldwork among Japanese diaspora in any location. And as such, he exerted immeasurable influence over scholarly approaches to emigration and assimilation, especially in Brazil, which was home of the largest population of persons of Japanese descent outside Japan. So I'm gonna now take a step back to provide some context on the Japanese emigration experience in Brazil, and then I'll bring the two threads of the talk together. So following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, emigration from Japan emerged as a solution to longstanding issues of rural overcrowding and resource scarcity. In particular, due to popular perceptions of immigrants as human scrap, the state stepped in to encourage expatriation through corporate subsidiaries and sponsorships. So settlement in Brazil began in 1908, 1 year after the so-called Gentleman's Agreement curtailed Asian immigration to the US, which was initially the most popular destination. Many Japanese settlers became contract laborers on Brazil's undermanned coffee plantations, and emigration corporations also purchased land on the Amazon frontier for Japanese farming cooperatives. By 1940, Brazil was home to about 200,000 Japanese immigrants and their descendants. Brazil's anti-immigration lobby represented them with grotesque metaphors, calling them cysts on the body of the nation or insoluble yellow sulfur. In the context of Japan's increasing geopolitical assertiveness, some suspected the diaspora of plotting an imperialist takeover or feared that they would assimilate white Brazilians. Alarmed that its nationals might be permanently excluded or evicted, the Japanese government took an unusually active role by comparison with other immigrant-producing nations in monitoring the conduct and reputation of its diaspora. So beginning in the years after World War I, the state sponsored officials, journalists, and others to travel to the Antipodes to report on and make policy recommendations regarding settlers. So as they found, immigrants tended to remain sequestered from outside society. In particular, endogamy remained the rule, with only about 3% of pre-war diaspora in Brazil identifying as quote unquote mixed blood. Meanwhile, various institutions emerged to build a sense of commonality among settlers. So newspapers and periodicals, schools, voluntary associations, baseball teams, martial arts studios, traditional poetry clubs, that kind of thing. Above all, emperor worship fostered a collective identity as members of the Japanese nation. In Japan, only students typically practiced a daily morning ritual of bowing to the emperor's portrait and reciting the imperial rescript on education, an 1898 pledge that affirmed loyalty unto death to the divine ruler. But in Brazil, entire communities would participate in these daily ceremonies. Japanese immigrants and their descendants tended to describe themselves in ways that emphasized their cherished status as children of a divine sovereign. So these are some of the common reference that were used in the pre-war period to denote Japanese immigrants. So isse, nisse, sansei, we still use these today, first, second, and third generation. Toho, born from the same womb, so emphasizing that biological connectedness. Nihonjin, so no reference to Brazil, no difference from people in the home islands. Nihon kokumin, Japanese national. Nihon shinmin, Japanese subject. Zairyu hojin, sojourner, emphasizing the sort of temporary aspect or ideologically temporary aspect of residence in Brazil. Fuhakusha crossed over to Brazil, but still, obviously, that's not primary. Zaihaku Nihonjin, Japanese in Brazil. And very, very occasionally, Nikkei or Nikkeijin, Japanese descendant. So this term does appear very infrequently in the pre-war literature. On the eve of World War II, the cohesiveness suggested by these terms was fortified by state persecution. Unlike other American nations, Brazil did not intern most of its Japanese diaspora. They were really economically important for Brazil. Still, communities suffered various checks on their freedom, including most critically the suppression of all Japanese language publishing. And at this time, most immigrants were still monolingual Japanese speakers and readers. So this forced them to rely on clandestine radio broadcasts from Japan for war news, which, as we all know, were reporting that Japan was doing well in the war. For Japanese citizens in Japan, there was empirical evidence to suggest otherwise, so perhaps defeat was less of a shock. But for Japanese subjects in Brazil who are only getting these messages, they were primed by this positive propaganda, unable to observe the situation firsthand. So many of them initially dismissed the imperial announcement of surrender on August 14th, 1945 as an Allied hoax. How many of them? About 160,000. So about 2/3 of the Japanese diaspora in Brazil. Several ultranationalist groups founded in the late stages of the war came together to form the Way of the Subject League, Shinnoremme, and this organization sort of advanced to the more palatable fiction that Japan had in fact vanquished the Allies. So extremists within this group forged images and other documents to nurture public belief in a Japanese triumph. They claimed that surrender was merely a tactic to lure the Allied fleet to Japan, where it would be destroyed by a high-frequency bomb more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some reported that General MacArthur was actually a prisoner in Japan, that imperial forces were planning an invasion of the United States, and that Japanese warships would shortly dock in Brazil to transport emigrants and their progeny home to a hero's welcome. About 50 fraudsters were arrested for selling fake tickets for passage on ships bound for Japan, and counterfeit deeds to land in its colonies. Most dramatically, in the 10 months from March 1946 to January 1947, Shindoremme militants carried out more than 40 attacks, including nearly 24 assassinations of people of Japanese descent who publicly urged the community to accept the reality of Japanese defeat. So this was initially an internecine Japanese problem, but when violence spilled over into non-Japanese communities, the Brazilian government actually called in the army to restore order. Law enforcement interrogated nearly 30,000 individuals, imprisoned several hundred, and remanded about 80 for deportation to Japan. State leaders held a summit meeting with about 400 Shindoremme representatives, many of whom had been released from jail for the occasion. And hoping to diffuse tensions, the government pledged to restrain the Portuguese press from reporting on Japan's defeat and unconditional surrender. Local Japanese language newspapers resumed publishing in early 1947 and were also asked to avoid direct references to defeat. These changes, combined with a weakening of Shindoremme through internal divisions and corruption, helped to bring about an end to the violence, but relations within the Japanese diaspora community remained quite fraught. So from the standpoint of Japan, Shindoremme was a catastrophe because it threatened Brazil's willingness to resume accepting Japanese immigrants. And this was regarded as a possible solution to the problem of reabsorbing some 7 million demobilized soldiers and civilian repatriates from the former empire. Moreover, as in the pre-war era, Japan was sensitive to international perceptions of its diaspora. The Brazilian media depicted Shindoremme terrorists as latter-day kamikaze, basically, the so-called suicide bombers who gave their lives to attack Allied forces in the final desperate stages of World War II. So like the kamikaze, the Shindoremme militants were viewed as incomprehensible, incorrigible, uncivilized. They embodied every stereotype that Japan needed to overcome in establishing its new post-war identity as a democratic, capitalist, and peaceful state. So this is where Izumi enters the picture. After learning of the situation in Brazil in late 1951, he applied for and received a fellowship from UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization, to study the Shindoremme crisis. UNESCO had come into being in November 1945 with the goal of diffusing anti-racist values and preventing another world war, although it was limited in this objective by the fact that it excluded the socialist states. Seeking to cultivate academic life outside traditional centers in Europe and the US, the organization offered grants to scholars who were committed to returning to their home countries and using their work abroad for maximum utility and influence, both nationally and internationally. So during the occupation, Izumi had worked on topics such as the resident Zainichi or Korean community in Japan, and also Japanese perceptions of foreigners. So by the 1950s, he had some experience studying racial discrimination and migration, but he knew very little about South America and spoke no Brazilian Portuguese. So he needed a local collaborator. Luckily, UNESCO had somebody in mind. Saito Hiroshi was born in 1919 in southern Japan and emigrated with his family to Brazil as an adolescent. Fully bilingual, he earned an undergraduate degree in sociology at the University of São Paulo, the nation's most elite institution of higher learning. And he then became a journalist, ultimately reporting on the Shindoremme crisis. Seeking to understand the mindset of Shindoremme, he read The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which is American anthropologist Ruth Benedict's famed wartime analysis of the Japanese psyche. He was impressed with the work, and so he wrote a letter to its Japanese translator, Odaka Kyoko, whose husband was Odaka Kunio, and a sociologist who happened to be the brother of the head of UNESCO's Japanese branch. Got that? Anyway, through this human chain, Saito emerged as the ideal research partner for Izumi. So on October 6th, 1952, Izumi donned a new suit and raincoat and boarded a Pan Am jet in Tokyo's Haneda Airport. After transfers in Honolulu, Los Angeles, Dallas, Miami, Lima, and Rio de Janeiro, he finally disembarked in Sao Paulo, and Saito was waiting for him. The pair immediately bonded over their love of sake and their mutual interest in social science. And Saito took Izumi to see his colleagues at the University of Sao Paulo and other Japanese immigrant intellectuals who welcomed a scientific investigation into the causes of the Shinnoreme crisis, which after all, they were the targets of the Shinnoreme assassinations. And they offered a lot of assistance with research. So they recommended communities for fieldwork and helped to translate surveys from Japanese to Brazilian Portuguese. So in each study location, Izumi and Saito chose about 50 households for profiling. And each household, they interviewed all members, distributed written surveys, and conducted personality tests. So this was the heyday of psychological anthropology. So there was a major emphasis on psychological diagnostics. Altogether, Izumi and Saito gathered data from 372 households, so about 1,400 people, and they also combed criminal case records and media publications. During this period of fieldwork, Izumi was utterly bewildered and not a little terrified by the level of collective self-deception. As he and Saito discovered, less than a quarter of the diaspora had immediately accepted the news of Japan's defeat in August 1945. And 7 years later, nearly 10% remained convinced that the empire had won the war. One research subject interpreted the very presence of a Japanese human scientist in Brazil as evidence that Japan had to have been victorious, arguing that a defeated country wouldn't have sent scholars abroad. It's logical. Izumi reported to colleagues at home he had never felt so much in danger of his life, not even during his fieldwork among headhunters in Japanese-occupied New Guinea at the time of the Allied naval invasion in 1944. In seeking to understand tensions within the diaspora, Izumi and Saito divided their research subjects into 3 categories. So acknowledgers, or ninshikisha, came to terms with Japan's defeat within a week of the emperor's announcement. Many young acknowledgers reported embarrassment at their community's violent resistance to the truth. Diehards, or kyokosha, abandoned belief in victory within a year, but nonetheless avoided overtly conceding the fact of surrender. One diehard compared public discussion of Japan's surrender to sharing the news of his father's cancer diagnosis, which he regarded as a private matter. The final group of fanatics, Kyogensha, maintained faith in an imperial triumph. And within this category, Izumi and Saito didn't differentiate between those who genuinely did not know and those who simply did not admit the truth. Fanatics bore responsibility for acts of terrorism against the acknowledgers and for various attempts to defraud and deceive the larger community, but they also got a lot of support from the diehards. So Izumi and Saito initially speculated that different rates of adaptation to Brazil might account for this range in attitudes towards Japan's loss in World War I. So they surveyed diaspora practices and preferences in food, clothing, shelter, child rearing, selection of marital partners, career aspirations, and attitudes towards the 2 countries. The interesting thing is that the results showed shockingly little variation among acknowledgers, diehards, and fanatics. All were highly assimilated. In no group did a majority own, let alone wear kimono or eat only Japanese cooking. Very few families lived in homes with tatami or communicated exclusively in Japanese. Across all 3 categories, respondents were overwhelmingly unable to identify Japan's ruling political party, and barely 10% could name the prime minister. Perhaps most tellingly, even fanatics overwhelmingly concurred that life in Brazil was pretty good. So Izumi and Saito ultimately found the key difference among these groups lay in their intentions regarding the duration of settlement at the time of emigration. They established a strong correlation between the determination to stay in Brazil and an acknowledgement posture, and a corresponding link between the professed desire to return to Japan and fanaticism. And diehards fell in between the two groups. So the defeat of the Japanese Empire unequivocally signified the permanence of what many Japanese settlers regarded as exile, however comfortable, from their place of birth. Deprived of this possibility of return, many immigrants and their descendants reported psychological turmoil. The comforting fiction of victory appealed even to those who were disinclined towards violence. Although Izumi viewed his fieldwork as scientific and objective, his use of the term fanatics, I think, betrays his distaste for the faction. To a survivor of the tumult and tragedy of Japan's defeat and occupation, somebody who had lived through it, this loyalty to militarism, fascism, and imperialism could not have seemed commendable or even comprehensible. On the contrary, adherence to pre-war ideologies was simply farcical to a human scientist attempting to disseminate and perform the new values of democracy, capitalism, and peace. To Izumi, Shindoreme terrorism appeared to reinforce precisely the perception of the Japanese that the post-war state was seeking to overcome. Likely owing to these considerations, Izumi and Saito's research, which was initially intended to illuminate the Shindoreme crisis, resulted in its obfuscation. Not until 1957, a full decade after the violence had subsided, did their writings actually appear in print. In fact, excepting a handful of short pieces and eyewitness accounts, the study of Shindoreme has languished to this day. The lasting impact of Izumi's research for UNESCO was not to theorize the violence, but rather to inspire work in the future on the Japanese diaspora in Brazil and beyond. So his next opportunity to study this community came in 1955, when the Japanese Foreign Ministry funded a large survey of immigrants and their descendants, again, speaking to that concern for the reputation of the diaspora abroad. As Japan's most experienced student of the topic, Izumi was appointed project leader, and he assembled a multidisciplinary group of 6 researchers. Again, he chose to work with Saito, who was then, at his recommendation, helping to build a South American Studies program, Japan's first, at Kobe University. In fact, Saito was the first foreign faculty member appointed to a Japanese university from outside Europe and the United States. Other team members included descendants of Japanese immigrants to Brazil and Japanese immigrant academics based at leading universities of the home islands. Despite the support of the Japanese government and some additional funding from the São Paulo municipality, Izumi's team struggled to cover research costs. To conserve resources, the Japan-based human scientists traveled to Brazil by sea rather than by plane. Their ship, the Brazil Maru, departed Kobe in late September 1955. And it was also carrying 561 Japanese citizens seeking new lives or family reunification in Brazil. So following the occupation, emigration to Brazil had resumed on a large scale, once again with financial incentives provided by the Japanese state. Altogether, approximately 60,000 Japanese settlers ventured to Brazil between 1952 and 1973 when the program ended. So the human scientists had nothing to do, so they took advantage of the opportunity to survey their fellow shipmates, ultimately carrying out about 150 interviews and Rorschach tests on post-war immigrants. Unlike their pre-war counterparts, many of whom had hoped to prosper in Brazil and then return home to Japan for their old age, most passengers on the Brazil Maru claimed a strong commitment to permanent relocation. And some had even signed contracts promising to remain in South America. In short, Izumi observed approvingly, they were very different from the pre-war settlers who had ventured abroad, hoping to repatriate and who had fallen victim to this delusion of victory. Upon reaching Brazil, the researchers dispersed among 16 urban, rural, and rainforest communities inhabited by Japanese diaspora. They studied some sites for the first time and revisited others to assess changes since Izumi and Saito's fieldwork 3 years earlier. Altogether, the team conducted interviews with approximately 800 households. Researchers sat down separately and concurrently with husbands and wives at home and spoke to children in schools and other locations. Their field report, Iming Migrants, was published in 1957. It's in this volume that Izumi and his collaborators made the landmark decision to reject language for the diaspora born in Brazil that suggested a primary identity as Japanese. And one reason was that in the eyes of the acknowledgers and acknowledger intellectuals like Saito, the use of these kinds of reference by Shindo Renmei had discredited them. So instead, the team adopted Nikkei or Nikkeijin, meaning persons of Japanese ancestry. As I've said, this term was not new. It did appear very infrequently in the pre-war period, but from this point on, we see it grow to overwhelming commonality. By replacing earlier reference with Nikkei, human scientists and progressive Japanese immigrants and their descendants sought to regain initiative in collective self-definition. I think, moreover, the delineation of Nikkei also signaled a new awareness of the diaspora as a population distinct from the Japanese in Japan. So Izumi didn't regard the local born children and grandchildren of settlers as Japanese, as they had customarily labeled themselves and been labeled. Instead, he saw them as defined by a unique fusion of Japanese and local physiological and cultural traits. Izumi and his team analyzed the Nikkei in Brazil in terms of religious affiliation, education, community organization, marriage and family life, socioeconomic status, language, settlement patterns, food, clothing, leisure activities, and historical and political views. They also examined attitudes towards community structures to assess how the Nikkei felt about their own assimilation. And in general, Izumi found that rather than a source of psychological discomfort, assimilation was increasingly unremarkable. In fact, the one noticeable manifestation of tension within the community actually offered further evidence of this Nikkei identity. That would be relations between the emigrant Issei and Brazil-born Nisei. So more than 70% of those surveys sensed a deep chasm between the generations. They expressed feelings like the Issei think mostly of Japan, while the Nisei are focused on Brazil, and stereotypes like the Issei are fussy and formal, and the Nisei are lazy and selfish. The second generation was less proficient in the Japanese language, less committed to Japanese nationalism, with only 2/3 agreeing with the hope, as expressed on a survey, that Japan would become a strong country again. Over half of Nisei converted to Catholicism, the majority religion of Brazil. Perhaps the most telling signifier of their assimilation was exogamy. Although the Issei had almost exclusively married among themselves, by the late 1950s, nearly a quarter of their grandchildren had only one Japanese parent. Among the third generation, rates of outmarriage exceeded 40%. While the assimilation of their children was a source of ambivalence or pain for many Issei, some Nisei even refused to participate in Izumi's study because they identified wholly as Brazilians. For Izumi and his Japanese colleagues, the transformation of Japanese into Nikkei was a positive development. Successful assimilation allowed researchers to dismiss the Shindo Renmei incident in hindsight as nothing more than a temporary interruption in the swift and successful adaptation of immigrants and their descendants to Brazilian society. Indeed, the success of the Nikkei appeared to confirm the imminence of Japan's democratic, capitalist, and peaceful values. The survey results published in Imi hammered hard at this depiction, showing, for example, that the Nikkei participated enthusiastically in Brazil's democratic politics, cherishing their obligation to vote, and even mounting their own candidates for national office. They were also said to contribute to Brazil's capitalist economy. By the 1950s, a majority of rural Nikkei-owned farms, a reflection of upward mobility, attributed to, quote, free individualistic competition and independent pursuit of economic improvement. In many regions, the Issei had accumulated greater average wealth than their Brazil-born neighbors. The children relocated to cities in pursuit of higher education and professional careers. Nikkei and non-Nikkei writers alike depicted the diaspora as the best Brazilians, actively contributing to the country by virtue of an allegedly quintessentially Japanese aptitude for development. And hearing this, it may not surprise you to learn that the study of the Nikkei also became enmeshed in the discourse of Japanese exceptionalism, Nihonjino or Nihon Bunkaron, in the 1980s. Finally, Imi also called attention to the pacifism of the Nikkei. When Japanese migration to Brazil resumed in 1952, proponents argued, if immigration is carried out properly and immigrants contribute to the development of the country into which they have migrated and are properly assimilated there, such immigration will be able to contribute to international peace. We therefore hope that as many people as possible will be sent abroad and immigration will be carried out in such a manner as will contribute to world peace and have beneficial effects on our country, Japan, as a whole. Izumi's team, drawing on interviews it had conducted en route to Brazil, characterized post-war immigrants as peace migrants, heiwa no imin. Their swift assimilation was to demonstrate the cooperativeness and increase global respect for the mother country. One human scientist on the team wrote, "Migrants do not merely object to war, but arrive with the determination to develop the resources of their new home, rectify global population imbalances, and live in a better world." No longer an abandoned people, they were a vanguard of the open, globally influential society that Japan sought to become, proud proof of the innate national inclination to the post-war values of democracy, capitalism, and peace. So following the publication of Imin, Nikkei swiftly prevailed as the most common referent for the diaspora, not just in Brazil, but throughout the Americas. In 1960, the Japanese government signified the official adoption of the term, hosting the first convention of Nikkei abroad, Kaigai Nikkei Taikai. Meanwhile, Nikkei studies emerged as a legitimate subdiscipline in its own right. Izumi himself conducted some follow-up research among Japanese descent communities in Peru, while 4 of his team members, including Saito, devoted many years of their career to the study of the diaspora. Izumi's research also attracted the attention of US human scientists. In the 1960s, we saw the emergence of hybrid studies, Japanese American studies, Chinese American studies, and so forth, as well as Asian American studies, which posited certain commonalities of interest and experience among Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and others. It was at this moment that terms like Japanese Brazilian or Nippo Brasileiro or Brasileira came to supplement Nikkei, not displacing it entirely, but offering an alternative formulation of identity that represented another step in the evolution of the collective identity of the community. So in this talk, I've uncovered the forgotten origins of the term Nikkei in mid-century Brazil, arguing that the term emerged from the combined needs of Japanese settlers who required a new way of understanding and talking about their community in the wake of the Shindoremme disorder, and Japanese human scientists who sought to use this community to establish Japan's democratic, capitalist, and peaceful character in the wake of an atrocious war fought in the service of very different values. So I'll just conclude with an anecdote that I think speaks to why this history has gone untold for so long. As I mentioned earlier, the Shindoremme violence had basically been resolved by the late 1940s, but there remain some immigrants and their descendants who refuse to acknowledge Japan's defeat even decades later. So in 1973, 3 Nikkei families, so 14 people, including elderly and working age adults as well as children, they landed at Tokyo's Narita airport. And members of the group had mostly never set foot in Japan, but gave interviews stating that they were ecstatic to be returning to their home country at last. They deplaned with shouts of Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the emperor, and headed straight to pay their respects at the Imperial Palace and Yasukuni Shrine, where the spirits of the war dead are believed to repose. Each morning of their visit, they woke and recited the imperial rescript on education, which had not been heard in Japan since 1945. To reporters, the group insisted that its quarter-century belief in Japan's victory was proven by the nation's contemporary economic prowess. Surveying the signs of prosperity all around him, 81-year-old Hamahika Ryoki, who had lived in Brazil since emigrating as a child in 1910, concluded, how could this be a defeated country? Though this inadvertent tribute to Japan's post-war recovery was not without logic, both Japanese and Nikkei journalists covering the story ridiculed Hamahika and his fellow travelers as psychopaths. The past was better forgotten. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Let's move to Q&A. We've got multiple friends right in the classroom. Sean, if you don't mind kind of overseeing the, but we'll start with Professor Tuck.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. This is absolutely fascinating. It's an angle that I guess the monolingual people like myself who work on Japan just don't see, and it's absolutely fascinating. I was really thrilled to see the depth of work and insight that this provides here. I do have a specific question. I'm a little curious about this. I noticed the term that Izumi used for what you translated as fanatics, the Kyogen-sha. That has certain literary resonances, doesn't it? Right? I mean, the Kyogen is the sort of comic plays that are the interlude with no drama, and it's used in other contexts. I mean, in the 60s, there was a term Kyogen jisatsu, which means a fake suicide. Can we draw anything from the choice of language here? Does this suggest Izumi thought this was in some sense a performance, or was ridiculous, or was some sort of farce, or what do you think?
You know, that's a really interesting insight that had never occurred to me, but seems so obvious now. I think maybe, yeah. I think there is a certain element of performance in this. I think it's really critical that he and Saito didn't distinguish between immigrants who didn't actually know that Japan had been defeated and those who knew but still weren't able to admit it publicly. In that, I think there's sort of a real parallel to be drawn with some of the Japanese soldiers who repatriated to Japan well after the defeat in World War II and came back in the 1970s, Yokoi Shonan and Onoda Hiro, who came back and said they had, maintained this steadfast faith in imperial victory all this time, they had maintained sort of like this idea that the war was ongoing, and so they sort of held out this possibility for themselves that the war had not reached a conclusion, but it didn't occur to them to imagine that Japan had won the war. And that's really different from this situation where the immigrant population was persuaded, or was able to persuade itself, that Japan wasn't still fighting, but had actually won. So I think it may have been in his mind that this was sort of a collective masquerade, a delusion, and sort of the residents of psychological anthropology at the time probably also encouraged that perception.
Denial is not just a river in Egypt, it's in Brazil as well.
I mean, I don't want to use trendy terms, but that's sort of like folie à deux, like the sort of collective madness that the psychologists have described.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? Just love it. I work on Germans in Brazil, and we should probably next time we could dance together. Fascinating stuff. So 2 questions. One, the Japanese government after the war, you said there was the international conference of. You talk a bit more about both the way the Japanese government after the war thought about diasporic Japanese populations in Brazil or in general, and how did that domestically, was that a controversial? What was the state view of these populations shared by, to what extent was that shared by actual Japanese citizens? And then also with Nikkei, as a non-Japanese speaker, is there, what does linguistically that mean in terms of, so the Germans in Brazil do the exact same thing, but they go to a term that is ethnic. If they go from being German Brazilians to being Tuto Brazilians, so Teutonic, so ethnic, they try and forget about the political past of Germany and get to, now of course that is a complicated term in itself. But I was wondering if Nikkei accomplishes something similar that is kind of sidestepping the political past and getting to something deeper identitary in what that does.
Oh, that's an interesting speculation. Let me take your first question first. So sort of what was the Japanese government and public, sort of where were we in this moment? So in 1945, Japan had about 7 million subjects abroad, and the economy was also in ruins. So all these people had to repatriate, some of whom had been colonial settlers in parts of the Japanese Empire for multiple generations, and others were soldiers and other kinds of repatriates who needed jobs very quickly. So the Japanese government felt a great deal of anxiety about what it was going to do with all of these people and how it was going to slot them them into this ruined economy. During the occupation, it wasn't possible for Japanese citizens to travel abroad. The occupation locked everybody in. And even in the years afterwards, those restrictions remained largely in place. But the Japanese government was very keen once it gained independence from the occupation to resume emigration as sort of a potential strategy of alleviating some of that perceived population pressure. So in that sense, the sort of concern for the sort of concern for Shindorenmei makes sense, because this was seen as being a reflection on Japan that might make Brazil less willing to accept Japanese immigrants, and Brazil had been the most enthusiastic destination for Japanese immigrants in the pre-war period. So I think that's sort of the origin of this intense concern about what the Japanese immigrants were doing in Brazil. And I guess the other sort of side of that is reputational, that it's not just for the practical purpose of securing a destination for immigrants, it's also that Japan has come through this war, sort of like developed this reputation, militarism, fascism, atrocity, that now the Shindorenmei is perpetuating into this era when Japan wants to move on as quickly as possible. So I think that's sort of the context. So, but it seems unlikely to me that this would have been functioning in the backdrop of the minds of ordinary Japanese citizens. The occupation controlled the press really tightly. And the Japanese Brazilian press was also not publishing about this because it was such a hot button issue that could get you assassinated. So it's unclear to me that most Japanese citizens would have known of this going on in the backdrop as they prepared to emigrate potentially. As far as your question about the term Nikkei, that's interesting. I think Nikkei, so if I'll go back to the sort of table that I need of sort of some of the most common reference. Sorry. Oh, sorry. To be honest, Nikkei doesn't stand out to me as being sort of less ethnic than some of the other reference. I think it wasn't, it really does mean Japanese descendant. Nihon, ni is the same character. And then Kie is also like the descent marker. So it's sort of comparable in many ways, I think, to Doho, which was this referent that was discredited. I think what really made Nikkei available as a marker for the post-war period was the fact that it was used so rarely. It existed, but it hadn't been used. So it appeared neutral, it appeared uncontaminated in a way these other terms didn't.
Thanks.
We did have a question online that I'm going to do my best. Well, there we go. Selena Galan asks, I may have missed it in the beginning, but was there a particular reason why Brazil was chosen as the place for Japanese to relocate to?
Oh, thank you for your question. Yeah, so initially, Brazil was not a particularly popular immigration destination. It was viewed as a sort of a backwards place, quote unquote, and the more economically promising destinations for Japanese nationals were the United States and also Hawaii. But in 1907, the Gentleman's Agreement curtailed Japanese immigration to the US and its colonies, which left Brazil as sort of a place that remained willing to continue accepting Japanese immigrants. So that was why more Japanese ended up in Brazil. And ultimately, the Japanese-Brazilian diaspora is still the largest Japanese diaspora in the world. Today, I think it's about 1.3 million people.
Thank you for your talk. You probably talked about this, but I probably didn't pick it up. But I'm just curious about, the development and the changes of this human science, like how with the pre-war and then the post-war, and also these change of components in the diaspora and their repatriation experience, how that discipline itself evolved. Was there like involvement and what were some of the boundaries where we can get a sense of development or changes over the time?
Yeah, sure. So in the pre-war period, the goal of human science was largely funded by the state, or at best by imperial universities that were funded by the state. So the emphasis was very much on research that would somehow be ideologically useful. And a lot of human scientists were able to combine that with their own personal curiosities. So much of the research in the pre-war period focused on the category of minzoku, which sort of was a fusion of racial and cultural traits. So fieldwork sought to illuminate some of those racial and cultural traits, both by measuring skull sizes and also by sort of immersion in local life. So this was really instrumental research. As I mentioned, Izumi's work among the Biak people who then ended up dead. And in the post-war period, but because it was so instrumentally focused, it was extremely unusual for human scientists during the pre-war period to venture beyond the borders of the Japanese Empire, or at least of territories that Japan thought it could acquire at some future time. So Izumi's entire pre-war career was contained within the Japanese Empire, and that was more or less normal. In the post-war period, all of these field sites that Japan had formerly ruled were really hostile to Japanese field workers, and in some cases, like China, not open to research. But it was unthinkable for a Japanese human scientist to go to Korea until the mid-1960s, for example. So they couldn't stay where they had formerly been. A lot of people came home, and this is really the origin of sort of professional self-study of the Japanese people and also Japanese minority. For instance, the study of the Ainu really boomed during the occupation period when Japanese human scientists couldn't travel abroad, but were still looking for others. And then after the end of the occupation, when it became possible to secure permission to go abroad again, because human scientists wanted to find these others, but were also not comfortable going to the empire, then we start to see this more internationalist oriented fieldwork in Brazil, in Peru. Izumi's next project after this one was as an Inca archaeologist. It seems on the surface politically disconnected. And instead of sort of the more traditional physical anthropology that they had practiced, they focused more heavily on culture. So this is really the point at which cultural anthropology becomes important in Japan. Dominates over physical anthropology or traditional folklore, and becomes infused with these values of democracy, capitalism, and peace. So looking for evidence that the Japanese were and had always been democratic, capitalist, and peaceful oriented, and that World War II was nothing more than a temporary aberration.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Yes, Lisa.
I was wondering about the Japanese people in Japan, how they received those immigrants when they chose to come back.
There were a few cases of that. In the pre-war period, it was still unusual, but not unheard of, for former immigrants to return to the home islands. Sometimes they didn't come back to resettle, they would come back to visit. One proponent of emigration wrote of he'd traveled back to Japan 4 times. And he said each time it was more disappointing because he longed for Japan. He built it up in his mind as this homeland where he hoped to retire and bring his children. And he said, actually, it's just a prison of hunger and poverty. So he ended up dying in Brazil. For the repatriates who came in the early post-war period, not just from Brazil, but anywhere, they were extremely unwelcome. A lot of Japanese people felt that they hadn't suffered the same way during the war, even though many of them had, right, coming from Manchuria or so on. But they felt like they hadn't shared in that collective suffering. And so there was a certain hostility because of that. And there were also economic competition in this moment when there were simply no jobs. So we don't see a ton of repatriation in that era from Brazil. And especially because the community had it pretty good. It was a very economically successful population. Even the Issei, for the most part, did pretty well. And I think that maybe also sort of speaks to the point that they sort of knew, right? That it wasn't that they didn't know Japan had been defeated, it was that they couldn't accept that. And then some of the repatriates from the 1952 to 1973 period, some people did come home. For Brazilian migrants, that was not a conspicuous feature. But Japan had other emigration projects that were a lot less successful. There's some scholarship on Japan's career in the Dominican Republic, sending immigrants to the DR who had been allocated these plots of land that turned out to be waterlogged, couldn't be farmed, and ultimately they sued to come back, and the lawsuits are still ongoing, but they've gotten some money for having been defrauded, basically, to sort of force them to expatriate. That didn't happen in any commonality with in the case of Brazil. And then in 1973, the sort of state-sponsored emigration program ended.
Yeah, sorry.
I have a couple of questions.
Go for it.
So first of all, thank you for this talk, and especially for the last anecdote. That was fantastic. I wanted to ask if you're aware of phenomena such as the Shindo-remme in other countries that were hosting communities of Japanese residents. That would be my first question. And then the second one, I'm curious to know whether there are specific prefectures or regions in Japan from which immigration to Brazil was particularly prominent.
Yeah, great questions. This was really the largest scale incidence of in which defeat was rejected. It really, I think, was born of such specific conditions. Anybody who sort of had empirical observation of what was happening in Japan or access to foreign language media probably would have been a little bit more primed for the idea that Japan was losing, oh, Japan lost. But the fact that the Japanese Brazilian population was so reliant on Japanese media and could only get that from Japan, which was producing a very different narrative, I think those conditions were really specific. That's not to say that it didn't happen elsewhere. We do have a few other small communities in which this happened, but not to the level of assassinations and fraud. Your second question was, the prefectural origins. Yeah, actually, interestingly, a lot of the Japanese Brazilians were of Okinawan descent. So Okinawa was itself colonized by Japan. It was the Ryukyu kingdom and annexed in the Meiji period. So Okinawans had their own language and culture, weren't traditionally regarded or regarded themselves as being part of the Japanese nation state. So by going to Brazil, they performed this interesting metamorphosis where they suddenly become representatives of the Japanese nation abroad in a way they couldn't be at home. And I think that, Izumi didn't write about that, but I think that that could be an additional element in this story, that they were so protective of their Japanese identity and so reluctant to lose that because they had, it was something that they had actually had to leave home to earn, in a sense.
That's really fascinating. There's no, I assume, no reflection on it in the social, like the writing of people like Izumi. I mean, to me, that's really interesting. You know, a large percentage of the settlers are from Okinawa. There's no.
He didn't talk about prefectural origins, which I was surprised about. He really. It's an interesting question because he was attuned to diversity in the Japanese home islands. He'd studied Zainichi, for example. But he didn't remark on that, which should have come up in a social science survey. He was a lot more interested in sort of the geographic dispersion of the immigrants in Brazil and sort of looking for differences between, for example, immigrants in the Amazon and immigrants in Sao Paulo state. So I think maybe he was preoccupied by that. The other thing I should note is that his publication on Shindo-remme, he did all of this field work, like mountains of interviews, hundreds of data points, and he only ended up writing a short chapter about it. So it may be that he collected that information, but just it didn't turn up any interesting observations.
Okay, that's really fascinating.
what did you find about this regional difference? Because there's between the small population settled in the Amazon and the large population in Sao Paulo.
So more immigrants emigrated to Sao Paulo with the intention of hopefully returning to Japan. And the ones who went to the Amazon thought they would be there a longer time. So there were more fanatics in Sao Paulo. So he did notice that. And I think that was probably the sort of key he used to sort of make the rest of his argument that it was this difference in regarding the intention of duration of settlement.
Were those choices? Were they offered a choice?
No. So this is also, I mean, this is sort of an inevitable fallacy of the social science research, but he's relying on people to report their intentions at the moment of emigration. It could be 30 years later. So how people remember that is also, I guess, there could be multiple ways of remembering that.
I think he's left academia, unfortunately, but there's a guy who in his PhD research looked at the ones who went to the Amazon and found that a lot of them had actually gotten special education from the imperial government as opposed to the free migrants to Sao Paulo. So that there were fewer Okinawans went to the Amazon. There were, I guess, main island Japanese, I guess you say, and a lot of them had been given like special preparation. In his study, he was looking at one of the admirals, I guess, like the Naval War College. Again, I'm way over my skis about anything in Japan, but wrote a treatise on how by occupying the Amazon, it could be a beachhead for Japanese colonization. And so there were plenty of people who passed through that kind of larger educational experience and then ended up all in the Amazon. So I don't remember how big that population number was, but I know that the scholarship always says the Amazonian Japanese populations are quite different from origin through to outcomes.
So the Amazon Japanese population, the only way to get to the Amazon in the pre-war period was if you joined sort of the Japanese government purchased these large tracts of land. Yeah. And so you sort of had to go as part of this sort of corporate project. Yeah. Whereas the immigrants who went to Sao Paulo, some of them did and some of them didn't. Mm-hmm. So there was sort of a heavier state overlay in the Amazon, and the state also preferred to send more Japanese people and fewer Okinawans too. So I think that was definitely part of it. So sort of the differences in the character of settlement in the Amazon and in Sao Paulo were also, I think, like he was right in picking up on that. Yeah. I think Japan, I've seen also references to immigrants in the Amazon having sort of political projects regarding Japan. But the government, I don't think did. Yeah. There's sort of no discussion of Japan becoming involved in Brazil except through an economic means. There was no sort of political aspiration towards imperialism in Brazil.
Any other questions, either in the classroom or see anything on the internet? Well, if not, let's thank Professor Kadia once again for a wonderful talk. Getting up to on such a wonderful note. Next time will be our very own Professor Daniela Laura, who will be speaking in February. Looking very forward to that. Thank you all for coming. We have a lot of food, and China's told me it all must go. So please stick around, visit with our speaker. You know, a sandwich, people online, we can mail you one. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you again, Professor Kadia.